I'd like you to meet Ken Kutaragi. Ken works at Sony. He's a common name around the office for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's a damn good electrical engineer. So much so that he caught the eye of Mr. Ibuka. And number two, he's a visionary. His co-workers thought him strange for wanting to push technology forward so quickly. But this is why he came to Sony. It was the only place Ken applied to after he graduated. He's a boundary pusher at his very core. Sony has a meritocratic system that awards talented engineers. Fancy corpos speak for, you do good, we pay more. Ken wanted to push the limits of technology. He just so happened to push the limits of everyone's patience as well. One executive told him, "You're just so cheeky and so close. It's disgusting. Don't come close to me." I don't think that translation is 100% accurate, but I think that feeling transcends language. The same website also seems to mention when raccoons are coming into season. Now, Ohm for plum wine is lined up in the supermarket. A little before that, raccoon season. For pickles, Racciola soil was sold in a plastic bag. Because I like the raccoon, I'm negotiating with Mr. Yom that I will buy it because I will pickle it. It was done many times. Our friend Mr. G Translate says it's actually, right now, green plums for plum wine are lined up in supermarkets, but just before that, it was pickled radish season. Pickled radishes with the soil still attached were sold in plastic bags. I loved pickled radishes, so I've been asking my wife if I could buy some for her to pickle, but she's always turned me down. You know you could just pickle your own radishes, Raccoon Boy? You don't need your wife for vinegar in a jar. Ken was struck by watching his daughter play with their Famicom, the original version of the NES. The exact story is muddled, but this is what I can piece together. Ken took a look at the NES and realized all the ways he could improve the sound. At this point, he's just that talented prick around the office, and he knew his bosses wouldn't be interested in video games, so Ken started to work in secret. Sometimes maybe at the office. Potentially using Sony supplies, who could say? When the SPC 700 sound chip was nearly finished, Ken was caught. Sony executives were about to pickle him like a raccoon until he was saved by the president, Norio Oga. The Music Man himself tells everyone to shut up and let Ken make them a bunch of money. The chip was finalized and sent off to Nintendo in the late 80s, the start of a very long and fruitful partnership. Let's pull back a little bit and catch up with Oga. Under his now paid leadership, Sony's products diversified. Music, film, gadgets, all were fair game. In the late 70s, Sony's continued innovation with the Walkman and Betamax video system, the eye of Lou Ottens from Philips. Lou Ottens, known as the inventor of cassette tapes, another absolutely fascinating guy. He carved a wooden block into the shape he thought a cassette should be, then accidentally smashed it when he used it to change a tire. At the same time, there was an arms race between MCA, Philips, and Pioneer. MCA pulled ahead with DiscoVision, which later became Laserdisc, like a DVD but the size of a vinyl record. There was a healthy debate on the size of the disc itself. 30 centimeters, about the size of a 12-inch vinyl, would hold 13 hours of music. However, an 11.5 centimeter disc would hold 60 minutes. Philips insisted on 11.5, the same diagonal length of a cassette tape and the proper fit for existing tape decks in European cars. Oka insisted on 12 centimeters, 75 minutes worth of music. He said, "Just as a curtain is never lowered halfway through an opera, the disc should be big enough to hold all of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony." Philips agreed, and the Music Man was overjoyed. They got right to work on what they called the Pickle Yeti. Sony and Philips took joint credit for creating the CD, compact disc as they were inscribed in the scrolls. It's exciting new technology, something that Ken wanted to get in at the ground floor of. It just so happened Ken made a few friends at Nintendo while developing the sound chip. He approached them with an idea. What if we put CDs on a Super Nintendo? Former CEO of Sony Music Entertainment and chairman of Sony Computer Entertainment, Shigeo Maruyama, gave an interview in 2016, translated by NintendoEverything.com. The interviewer, Kawakami, states the PlayStation was originally a dedicated Nintendo device. This was the accepted truth at the time. Maruyama said, "That's not entirely true. Ken Kutaragi was originally in charge of the sound chip on the Super Nintendo before he worked on the PlayStation. Sony was just supplying components, with Kutaragi in charge of production." He then said, "However, Ken was a strong advocate for pursuing CD-ROM over cartridges. Ken annoyed them until they said, 'Alright, we don't think it will be successful, but you can do your CD-ROM thing.' Ken eventually whittled them down so much that Nintendo of America president Minoru Awakawa said, 'If they let Kutaragi do whatever he wants, he might take over the whole company.' Maruyama explained that the deal went sour, but he wasn't sure why. He thought maybe Yamauchi was intimidated by Ken. A little bit later, Maruyama was asked if Sony had any intentions of joining the game industry. He said, 'We explicitly told them we were going to focus on everything but video games, and they said, that's fine.'" June 1st, 1991. CES, the Consumer Electronic Expo in Vegas. Sony announces their plan to enter the game industry. They unveiled their partnership with Nintendo and the anticipated SNES CD, the power to play cartridge games, and soon games on disc. Great news. Some people were unhappy about this. None more unhappy than Nintendo. See, they hadn't even announced the Super Nintendo was coming to North America yet. They were planning on announcing it later that day, but someone at Sony jumped the gun, after telling them they had no plans on entering the game industry. So Nintendo cut them off. After rechecking the working agreement they had signed in 1988 with Sony, they decided to go with Philips and the CDI, also co-developed by Sony. Howard Lincoln, vice president of Nintendo of America, didn't share details, but he said the deal was unfavorable. He did say, "Our engineers have reached the conclusion that from a technical standpoint, that it was better for Nintendo to work with Philips." On if the agreement with Philips was more favorable than the one with Sony, Lincoln said, "I would rather not comment on that, or compare the two." Now the burning question. How bad was this deal to make Nintendo cancel their 3-year working relationship with Sony? Well, Sony spilled the beans themselves. Verbatim from the New York Times, 1988 deal is disclosed. The Sony machine adds a compact disc player to the new Nintendo system. Because the PlayStation incorporates Nintendo's new machine, Sony is making the machines under license from Nintendo. Sony has supplied computer chips to Nintendo for several years. While Sony and Nintendo have collaborated on the machine, Sony will clearly become a competitor of Nintendo. Under the arrangement, Nintendo could introduce its own machines incorporating compact disc players. Sony confirmed yesterday that it had retained all licensing rights for any compact disc game developed for the new system. The deal was negotiated in 1988, but had not been publicly known until they told on themselves. In essence, Nintendo would produce the Super Nintendo, and Sony would produce a CD attachment. However, Sony would retain the rights to all games released on CD, even if Nintendo made their own separate CD console. Nintendo bears the brunt of all the production costs, and Sony gets all of the money. Undeterred, Ken took his idea to Sega and Tom Kalinske. Tom Kalinske, the former president and CEO of Sega of America. a guy who's currently beating Nintendo in the games industry. He loved the idea, Sony's access to music and movies with Sega's software expertise. Unfortunately, Sega Corp in Tokyo said no. Tom gave an interview with GamesIndustry.biz in 2015 shedding his light on the situation. Verbatim, "One of the key reasons why I left Sega is when we had the opportunity to work with Sony. When Olaf Olafs and Mickey Schulhoff and I agreed we were going to do one platform, share the development cost of it, share the probable loss for a couple years on it, but each benefit from the software we could bring to that platform. Of course, in those days, we were much better at software than they were, so I saw this as a huge win. We went to Sony and they agreed. Great idea. Whether we called it Sega Sony or Sony Sega, who cared? We go to Sega and the board turned it down, which I thought was the stupidest decision ever made in the history of business. From that moment on, I didn't feel they were capable of making the correct decisions in Japan any longer." So after all that, where does that leave us? Well, back to Oga, of course. Ken enrages him in a meeting, causing Oga to say, "Go for it. Do it. This is a project that Sony needs to be in on." So Ken do it. In '95, the PlayStation was merely a home video game system to Sony. In '96, they earned a name. In '97, the PlayStation is a major contributor. And then in 1998, it had its own division.
Let's cooking. 今日はクッキング対決。クラッシュさん、パラッパさん、張り切っていきましょう。おっと、クラッシュさん、今日は珍しく真剣です。一方、パラッパさんはどうでしょう。良い子です。ああ、気持ちいい。パラッパさんはハンバーグ。クラッシュさんは果物を取り出した。なるほど。ハンバーグといえば当然ミキサー。果物といえば当然油炒め。火は強火です。不思議な匂いが会場に立ち込めてきました。さあ、お味の方は。どうやら美味しいようですよ。そうは見えないけど。リンゴの三段ソテー、アジの開き添え、伊勢海老のフロマージュソーストロピカル風。では試食していただきましょう。それはあなたです。
私？
お手をどうぞ。
何なのこの料理。
好き嫌いはやめようね。
プレイステーション。
So ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the video. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Next video is different than originally planned and for the better. I'll see you next time in the quarry.